So, hello everyone. I'm Martin Sparrius. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Portsmouth. And today I'll be presenting the work that myself, Moufida, Sadok, and Peter Bednar have been doing looking at information security policies in UK schools. Now, I was warned at the beginning of my PhD that you would go on a strange journey, but I didn't really expect to get to the stage I'd be excited about reading policies, to be honest. My memories from my previous career in teaching is that they were at best something you did as a legal requirement. At worst, they were something that was filed in a dusty corner of the staff room and never regarded again. And that is a huge pity because ISPs can be incredibly handy. And certainly they're recognized as a key component in managing your information security, especially as come what may, your employees are still expected to adhere to them, even if they don't necessarily understand them or even read them in the first place. Now, generally speaking, an ISP consists of three aspects: procedures and controls. This could be something like your password security, something normally to do with legal requirements for your country. In the UK, this would be the GDPR or the Data Protection Act. And then generally, again, it's expected that these policies will be given out to the employees and any relevant external partners to have a read and then probably sign off on. That agreement kind of ends there. From the reading of literature in this area, there is substantial debate about the level of content, the type of content in it as well, even the nature of which is presented to the staff members. Different frameworks have different suggestions, but there's still no clear, coherent advice, particularly to schools, about what they should actually have in their information security policy. And on top of that, UK schools are incredibly diverse. Now, as schools have gone more and more digital, the amount of data they hold has increased multiple times over the last decade. It ranges from parents' details to financial records, students' medical and contact information, let alone things like assessment grades and exam details. And as schools consolidate, this data is being held increasingly on centralized databases that are administered potentially by other organizations. For those not aware of the UK's education framework as well, it's also very fragmented. We don't have a central body for education in the sense that some other countries do. So schools will vary from county to county, certainly from different components of the UK, so like England versus Wales. And on top of that, we have a substantial private industry when it comes to school organizations. And these within will take their own approach to how they approach education and organization. As such, there's very little central control or advice to these schools. This has changed over the last couple of decades. It used to be more centralized, but the government's policy at the moment is to decentralize this and hand authority back to the schools. But as a result, there is no IT training program for teachers or school organizations that is centralized and organized by the government. The only thing they're really required to do is report serious data breaches to the ICO. And this is part of the GDPR, which is a data protection regulation. And otherwise, there's no independent oversight in terms of information security. There is a little bit of overlap when it comes to child safety and safeguarding, but that is very tangential these days. Having said that, though, those policies that schools do have to put together are called statutory policies in the UK, and they are published on the school's websites. Having said that, an ISP is not one of those policies. Though thankfully, a number of schools do publish these policies anyway, and they're out there for public review. Now, this sort of situation has flagged with the UK government. Over the last sort of 5 to 7 years, the UK government has run what they call a cybersecurity breaches survey each year. Now, for the last 2 years, they've included an education annex to this, where they have consulted with various schools about their cybersecurity frameworks, what's going on, and how they're sort of approaching things. Now, at this stage, I do need to point out that these responses are the result of a telephonic survey. 378 education organizations responded to the survey in the end, but this is out of possible 25,000 schools in the UK. All these responses were voluntary, If the school did not want to take part in the telephonic survey, they just backed out. And also it's all self-reported. There was no independent confirmation of these figures following publication. So as kind of published, that most schools do say that they have an ISP of some kind. With this in hand, though, we've got nearly 50% of the surveyed schools reporting some kind of security breach. Now, this varies hugely. It can be a USB stick left unguarded. It can be a phishing email. It's a very broad categorization in terms of the survey. What is more worrying, though, is that nearly 10% of the surveyed schools reported some kind of weekly breach, which does indicate a fairly high failure rate, in a sense, of their information security. Of these schools that reported, almost all of them reported that the breach had a negative impact on their organization. Now, schools in the UK are incredibly tight for time, especially when it comes down to the exam procedures. Any loss of weeks due to disruption will have a direct impact on student progression, but also it has an impact on student intake. A lot of schools' funding is very dependent on getting sufficient numbers of students in. Anything reputational can impact on student intake and as a consequence on the finances of these organizations. As a result, almost all the schools said that cybersecurity was a high priority for them. The awareness has increased over the last years. A number of news articles have popped up in the UK of schools being ransomware or having severe data breaches. The problem came into where the schools were looking for advice. So only 2/3 of these schools actually said they went and looked for advice from an external or government source. The other third are presumed to have consulted their computer or IT departments to come up with the approach to cybersecurity. Of the 66%, though, only 21 had any kind of awareness of the UK's Cyber Essentials scheme. Now, this is a very basic scheme the government's put forward to SMEs in particular, on a basic sort of 6-point plan where you can secure your network against the basic fundamental information security issues. The fact that only a fifth of schools were even aware of it does highlight a problem of this advice that the government's potentially offering, but it's not getting through to organizations in the first place, and certainly impacts on what they would consider appropriate for an ISP. And it does give us a sort of information gap that needs exploring. And this is where we went with our work in this regard. We conducted an exploratory study where we found 100 public accessible IS policies. These were largely on schools' websites themselves. And we then downloaded these policies and had a read through them. These schools were linked with the UK's database on schools, so we're able to get the official school statistics on size and type, location. We then coded them for content, and analyzed them in Vivo 12. On top of this, we then did a readability analysis using Smog and Flesh, and I'll get into some details on those in a little bit. And then as an inadvertent silver line to the COVID epidemic, we went back and reanalyzed them after a year to see how these ISPs were either being updated or not, as the case may be, to adjust for all the remote working restrictions that the UK was facing over the COVID pandemic. For those who are not aware, a lot of the schools, I'll take that back at you, all the schools for a lot of the time were working from home in terms of student access. And it did necessitate a huge change in working practice from going from a classroom-based physical environment to a fully digital virtual environment in the space of a couple of weeks. Now, the coding itself, we used a work by Weidman and Vosklas, who looked at US universities, and they highlighted in particular that there was a great deal of difficulty getting hold of an information security policy from an organization. A lot of these organizations regard it as a very sensitive document. And this is where the public accessible nature of the school ISP policies came into their own. It proved to be a veritable treasure trove of information that wasn't out there for a lot of other organizations. So we were able to use their work at looking at universities and group our coding into two main categories. As I said, the security management, which is more about the organizational philosophy and information security structures, and then the computer security side of things, which is more the technical controls and specific user user responsibilities. Now, in both cases, these were further subdivided, and some of the coding was very particular. And so what we did is looked at 10 samples just to start off with, and we refined our coding by looking at these two and then moving on to the rest of the 100. It is important to stress that we did not make any judgment calls about the quality. The code was assigned irrespective of what was written. So if the policy talked about data protection, and it was actually more along the lines of child safeguarding, that was not massively relevant to us. We coded it as it was. It was also not taking into account any sort of quality in terms of actual technical controls. So if the password advice was severely outdated, again, we just coded it as it was. We then conducted a matrix query in NViva 12 to start seeing what codes were occurring with what combinations of schools and what patterns. Now from this, we found a few rather interesting facets. So the first thing we had to look at was what the schools reported in their response to the government survey to what we found in terms of ISPs. Now, I do need to stress, at no stage were we able to or sought to match schools that responded to the survey with our actual ISPs. But considering the breadth of ISPs we got off from these various schools, we are fairly confident that this represents a broad spectrum of UK schools and what is likely to be out there. But we are aware that the schools responding to the government survey are probably the best case scenario, as it was a voluntary survey. Either way, there is a massive discrepancy in certain aspects of what the schools reported and what was in their ISPs. Now, it is probably correct in assuming that a lot of schools still conduct these activities even if they're not in the ISP. I really doubt that schools don't patch things, even if only a quarter of them talked about it in the ISP. But it does mean it's occurring at a level that is in the background, and certainly is not something that's been explained to their staff in any shape, way, or form. So things where we saw a lot of occurrence are passwords. No massive surprise there. 87% of the schools had some kind of password control section in their policy, explaining to some degree why we needed a password and what was a strong password. But this fell off quite dramatically when it came to other sort of controls, particularly things like malware, firewall, and backups. If they were there at all, they were stated as occurrence and with no real explaining to the staff of what they had the importance of. There was very little in terms of both reporting and occurrence in terms of bring your own device. And this is largely because schools as a whole, due to the child's safeguarding nature, didn't generally allow staff to bring in their own devices to this. And this was just dealt as something that was not occurring. This changed obviously massively with COVID, and it's something we'll discuss a little bit later. Also, what is worth mentioning is that over half the schools do monitor their networks. This is primarily focused on staff and student usage, not in terms of checking for data breaches or security. On top of this, we also had a look at what the government was highlighting as major breach occurrences. So in the breach survey itself, schools reported their main breach incidents were down to fraudulent emails, website redirects, and phishing attacks. This was by far the most common data breach, security breach that was occurring at a school. On a smaller level, we had the malware and DDoS attacks. Now, while these do get a lot of news attention, and rightfully so, ransomware and DDoS attacks on schools are still at a slightly lower level. They're still primarily directed more at higher education, like universities. And while there is an increase, a lot of the issues are more along the lines of attacks directed at the staff, trying to get details out to normally launch some kind of financial scam or attack on the school itself. So with this in mind, we had a look at the IS controls that were dedicated to this sort of attack, and they were quite low. While there's a lot of focus on passwords and potentially the fact that you should have a backup or firewall, there was relatively little on educating staff about the nature of these security incidents, particularly how to recognize them. There were phrases about that you should report it, but nothing about what you actually should look out to report. Also, not so much in terms of educating the staff themselves on how to recognize spam or phishing attacks. Now, it's entirely possible this occurring in the background, but again, it highlights perhaps a lack of linked up thinking that could be evident in an ISP, especially in terms of what would happen now that the schools went to a COVID lockdown. And this is why we consider things like the Wi-Fi and MFA. With schools in lockdown, a lot of staff and students suddenly had to start work from other locations and having to log in from remote locations like their home. And schools were very ill-equipped for this by the look of it, with only 15% even considering how people would use a public Wi-Fi network in terms of accessing schools infrastructure, and almost none of them dealing with the idea that you should have some kind of multi-factor authentication into it. It highlights a massive gap between what the ISPs were kind of preparing to secure against and the threat landscape that was occurring as we were speaking during the COVID epidemic. One other factor we did consider as well is readability. So it's all well and good having an ISP that is content rich, but not if none of the staff could actually be bothered to read it in the first place because it was so awkward. Now, readability scores do vary, but the primary context of them is they look at the length of a sentence and the complexity of the words in that sentence. Now, we chose to use two, Flesh Reading Ease, due to its popularity in research, but we also used the second one to kind of qualify the Flesh score, and that's the SMOG. Now, the reason we picked SMOG is that the UK's National Health Service has done a lot of work in trying to make their medical information as publicly accessible as possible. And considering the complexity of some of this information, it's kind of used as a nice sort of benchmark, I think, for IT as well. What we did was took every single ISP, converted them into a text document where they were a PDF or perhaps a picture file, and then loaded them into Readability Calculator. Now, as part of this, unfortunately, no diagrams, flowcharts, or images were able to be analyzed. But generally speaking, this is a fairly limited content reduction for most of the ISPs. So otherwise, we loaded them as they were. And there was a huge amount of variation. Now, as a whole, most policies required you to have a level of education that would imply that you went to university to access. Now, for the UK, this is about half the adult population. For schools, every single teacher does need to have gone to university. So they can access it, but it does require a cognitive load that is still substantial. What is perhaps a little bit more worrying is that most of the policies required about 20 minutes worth of solid reading to go from the beginning to end. Now, it's unlikely that most people would have undertaken this, and you would instead skim read it to try and find what you thought was important, or even worse, go straight to the end where the signature box was. So there is a concern about the readability of a lot of these policies. What is more worrying, though, is that one standard deviation upwards put most of the policies in that bracket into the hard to access category, with some of them being utterly atrocious. Now, whether that's length or readability is a bit of debate. On one hand, we had a one-page policy that was literally a restating of a CIA triangle. On the other hand, we had a 20,000 word behemoth from a county council that was everything in the kitchen sink. Even worse, it was a mishmash of policies content, appendices, forms, back to policy content. It was almost inaccessible at the end of the day. So what you've got here are policies that are potentially not quite meeting the needs of the threat landscape, coupled with an accessibility on some level to engage the staff. Just to check, we then went back, as I said, a year later to see how these policies were coping with the COVID epidemic. So we went and reassessed every single one of the 100 ISPs that we had gathered earlier in the year. We grouped them into those needing updates and those that were technically not needing updates. This was based largely on the dates that were assigned to the documents themselves. Within these categories, we then looked at whether there had been any change whatsoever, whether the change had been meaningful in some shape, way, or form, whether the policy had been converted. Some policies moved from being a general IS policy to something like an acceptable use policy, and then whether the policy was still available. Now, based on this, We found that none of the policies originally had any kind of reference to remote working, primarily because schools didn't actually consider it as a possibility. 53 of them had some kind of discussion, but it was primarily to do with data security, moving data from the office back to work and again, so in case of like USB encryption. Of the 72 ISPs that were due an update due to their own numbers, only 34 had received some kind of revision, and some of them were substantially out of date. We're talking up to 7 years in some cases. Of the 34 that received revision, as stated, only 7 were meaningfully changed. And of those 7, only 3 had any kind of reference to remote working or content delivery. So what we are seeing, unfortunately, is these policies, once constructed, were largely put up on the websites and left alone. Of those that were not receiving of any kind of meaningful update, the update was largely a date change. So literally taking exactly the same policy and just tagging on another year extension to it. Of the 28 that were not due any kind of policy, encouraging 2 were revised, I guess, but only 1 of those had anything to do with remote delivery. So realistically, we're looking out of the 100 ISPs that we looked at, only 4 were proactively updated to deal with the COVID epidemic. Now, it is entirely possible that work was being done in the background. A lot of the schools were massively pressed for time, and I'm pretty sure that updating ISP was perhaps not a priority for many of these schools. But this was done during the second lockdown, for which was about 6 months after the first lockdown, which means the schools have had time to have gone through the lockdown process, find some kind of method of doing remote delivery, and then coming back to normal schooling again and having the entire summer holiday. So there was time potentially to take on board the lessons that they had learned during the lockdown and try and implement them into the ISP. So in conclusion, schools in the UK are increasingly under attack. There was a discussion from the National Cybersecurity Centre a couple of weeks ago on 2 schools just down the road from Portsmouth who had been ransomwared and lost everything. This was including coursework, exam materials, and it was kind of deliberately targeted just in our assessment period before the marks should have been uploaded to our national centres. The criminals are not stupid. They know exactly when to target the schools to get the best bang for their buck. Unfortunately, according to our research, it appears that the school ISPs themselves are not being adapted to deal with this. And even if they do have some relevant content, they're not being designed in a way that kind of involves the staff and encourages them to become more IS aware in the first place. This can just be simply fixed in some ways by involving the staff on a more socio-technical level. Get their input about what they're doing, how they're doing it, what they understand about it. But the implication of a lot of our reading is that these policies are being constructed by the IT department in isolation from a lot of their staff. And it is given out to the staff as a sort of take it or leave it approach to how to do the information security governance. Now, based on our research, there are some additional explorations which we're having a look at. I can't actually believe I'm saying this. It was actually fascinating reading the 100 ISPs in the first place. The difference in tone, how they approach the language in it was phenomenal. And a lot of it was very, very aggressive. Now, unfortunately, our profession is by nature of the beast rather negative. We just talk about disaster recovery, talk about incidents, we talk about security. And this comes across in our language. But it doesn't mean that you can't think about how to make things more encouraging. And again, the NHS has looked at this and things like cancer treatment and how to make the pamphlets more proactive to engage people rather than to scare them. And work could be done on these. And then finally, and probably most importantly, is to get the view from the other side of the fence. And this is where we're continuing our research at the moment by actually working with teachers to understand what they think about information security and their views on how to get more involved and what will get them more involved and more proactive about information security. So now thanks for listening to me. If you've got any questions, please do fire them away. Otherwise, thank you for this opportunity and I hope you found it interesting.